Now is the time to move away from a system that for decades has been based on prohibition of cannabis into a regulated legal market.
We are getting a first look today at what marijuana legalization might look like in this country. A task force set up by the federal government has just released its report, all 100 or so pages of it, with more than 80 recommendations inside. Now, they tackle almost every aspect of what a world with legal weed would look like. But some of the key points: you shouldn't be able to sell to anyone under 18. But provinces should also be free to tweak that to bring it in line with drinking ages. Here in BC, it's 19, for example. There should also be limits on advertising, like some of the restrictions we see on cigarettes and tobacco. No marketing to kids, that sort of thing. And when it comes to the packaging, it should be plain. Nothing flashy, nothing that would appeal to kids, just basic information, and that's it. And another big one: only businesses dedicated to cannabis should be allowed to sell it. So you shouldn't be able to get it at a grocery store or even a liquor store, for example. Now, for all the things the task force seems pretty clear on, there are still a number of other big outstanding questions about how exactly things will work. So we've got Anita Bath on the story for us. Anita, I mentioned the idea of dedicated storefronts where a person might be able to purchase cannabis products, marijuana, but there are other options on the table as well.
Yes, now there are a lot of options that are being kind of thrown around there, but they all still need to be worked out. No clear answer yet. One of the other recommendations is that people can grow it themselves, and they'd have to actually have a limit of 4 plants in each home. Maximum height for each of those plants would be 100 centimeters. Now, what about if you don't want to grow it for yourself? Because I'm sure there are a lot of people out there like that. They're also recommending a mail order system. This would help give access to people who live in remote communities where storefronts may not be available, or it's hard for them to get to a storefront. But the task force also says this lowers the risk of people selling weed illegally. Then there's also the recommendation that provinces and territories can decide for themselves how and where they want pot to be sold. Now, this would mean that we would actually see totally different models all across the country.
And then I'm curious to know, depending on which option actually the provinces or the country actually end up settling on, what does that mean for the existing dispensaries, the existing growers?
Well, so that question was asked today to the task force, and they basically said they want to see a diversity of sellers. I'll let them explain.
And even now, with the licensed producers, many people don't understand that there are large licensed producers, but the vast majority of them aren't large. Some of them are actually quite small and have been able to meet the regulatory standards presently in place.
Okay, so buying and selling, that's one thing. I know the subject of driving also came up, right? This idea of driving while under the influence of marijuana. What's the plan to tackle that?
Well, there are some pretty complex challenges with this one. One of them, of course, being, what the legal limit should be for people smoking up and then driving. Now, right now, the impaired driving law says it's a criminal offense to operate a motor vehicle, whether in motion or not, while impaired, which includes driving with a blood alcohol content exceeding 80 milligrams of alcohol in 100 milliliters of blood, so 0.08 blood alcohol level, or impairment by a drug. Now, nothing huge needs to change in the criminal code. The feds do admit, though, there's really not much research about how much is too much when it comes to pot and driving. So the task force is recommending figuring out if there should be a limit and basically what that limit should be. Now, Washington and Colorado have both adopted the threshold of 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood. This is similar to the 0.08 blood alcohol level for drinking if you're able to compare it. The problem is everyone is so different that having that number 5 may actually not work at all.
A tolerant individual may not be exhibiting any signs of impairment, and that's where the 5 is somewhat troublesome.
And of course, testing is a tricky part as well. Unlike alcohol and the breathalyzer, there's actually no universally accepted roadside test for marijuana impairment. Now, in Ontario, police there and the RCMP are testing out 3 devices right now. Those devices, though, focus on saliva. So they'll take an oral test, and then from there, they'll see what the THC level is. Washington and Colorado use a blood test, but that obviously has to be sent in and isn't really immediate.
Right. So beyond all of this, beyond the idea of driving, buying and selling, advertising, marketing, minimum ages, all that sort of thing, how much further do they have to go? I mean, how much more is there for authorities to figure out?
Quite a lot of things. I mean, if you really think about it, there are so many questions around this because it's such a huge thing. Life insurance is one. So I tried to get to the bottom of this today to see if your life insurance premiums would go up if you admit that you're a pot smoker, similar to what happens with cigarettes. I wasn't able to get any answers around that. And I think it's just really too early for all of these people to actually tell.
Or whether you would have to even declare it, right?
Exactly, yeah. And how strict they will be about that, right? Will it be similar to cigarettes or will it be completely different? Especially with, looking at medical use as well.
Right.
So,
what are some of the other things that came up in your research?
one of the other ones was basically price. So how much will it cost to buy weed? I'm sure a lot of people are asking that today. And there's no clear answer on that one either. Now, they are saying that they want to have higher prices to help deter people from using, but they don't want to have the price too high that it actually pushes people then to go the illegal route. Now, there was one other thing that was actually asked to the task force today at the news conference, and that's criminal records. So how does it affect my criminal record if I'm somebody who has already been convicted and sentenced of a marijuana-related crime? If a new law comes in decriminalizing it or legalizing it, does that mean that I should actually be able to now just have my record wiped as well? So while this report and recommendations from the task force is a pretty big step forward for a lot of people, it really did just bring on a lot of questions, many of which will have to be answered in the next little while.
Okay, thanks so much, Anita. Now, you folks at home, you heard Anita mention Colorado and Washington as two states that have legalized marijuana. Well, Oregon is another. They were the first in the U.S. to decriminalize possession of small amounts of marijuana. They were the first to authorize it for medical use. And people have been able to buy it recreationally from dispensaries for more than a year now. So let me bring in Casey Houlihan into this conversation. He is the executive director of the Oregon Retailers of Cannabis Association. And Casey, I'm curious to know what your overall impression is, first of all, of some of the recommendations that we've seen from the task force here in Canada.
Andrew, first of all, thanks so much for inviting us on here. Overall, this seems like a really great step forward and a great deal of progress that could be made towards ending prohibition in Canada. And I think that this is going to be a very interesting way to see how the different provinces are also able to tackle some of the more specific local regulations, not unlike the way the different states here have gone about different paths and developing their local policies as well.
Are there particular aspects where you feel it falls short, or maybe it needs to be better thought out, or where you see pitfalls ahead?
I think that not unlike any other system that's being adopted by a state, and we've certainly seen no shortage of this here in Oregon, as well as Colorado and Washington. I'm sure California has also been running into a fair amount of problems, but just developing all of these solutions that are going to have to work at a local level to either incorporate existing businesses in places where a gray market has been operating. Obviously, that's somewhat problematic. We noticed that in the latest recommendations, they're still calling for the enforcement of prohibition during the transition period as well, which could lead to a lot of needless arrests and continue the disproportionate incarceration of people of color.
Right, and I mean, you look at the range of issues that are potentially involved here, and I suspect there are many that will be fairly non-controversial. Advertising to minors, as an example. There's probably little disagreement on that. I'm curious to know from your end what some of the more contentious issues have been.
Well, one that we've certainly at present at least still failed to reach consensus on here in the state of Oregon is the extent to which we will allow for or license or regulate public consumption venues, which I actually do think is a great example of one of the areas where the recommendations that we saw this week in Canada actually does go a lot further than a lot of the policies that we've seen so far. In the states, including those that have legalized thus far, Colorado is the only one that has dabbled in that area. I believe Alaska is still developing some of its rules surrounding that as well, but certainly no high-density state other than, I believe, the city of Denver has done anything to explore the public consumption side. So this is actually an area where, certainly areas like Vancouver, British Columbia have been, years ahead of the United States in many ways in this capacity.
And one thing that Canada's task force seemed to repeatedly loop back to was this idea of expect surprises. What do you think they meant by that? I mean, what are some of the surprises that may be around the corner?
I think that certainly the thing that we saw here, and certainly that proved to be surprising to most of the doubters or the skeptics when we were, first pursuing a legalization strategy, was just how big of a deal it wasn't. And certainly there were a lot of calls early on that this could raise concerns about increased traffic fatalities. That did not prove to be the case in any of the states that have legalized it thus far over time. We've heard, increased counts of the black market finding other avenues, but we haven't seen that either. We've seen a really great diminishing of the black market, certainly in Oregon, as a result of legalized sales. And it's certainly a better way of preventing youth access as well, when all the people that are making sales are on videotape or otherwise being regulated and tracked by the state, or in your case, province, territory, what have you.
Right. Okay, Casey Houlihan, nice of you to join us from Portland in Oregon. Thanks for being on the program.
Likewise, Andrew. Thanks so much for inviting us.